The old chapel bell on the Beaumont plantation was the heartbeat of their cruel world, ringing out every hour, every day. But one moonless night in 1848, it did something it had never done before. It rang a 13th time. The sound cracked through the humid Georgia air like a prophecy, followed by the groan of splintering wood and the crash of falling stone. By dawn, the tower was a pile of rubble, and Clara, a quiet woman who worked in the main house, was gone. They searched for days, but all they ever found was her simple cotton kerchief, tied deliberately to the bell's rope, a final, silent message. Did she make the bell ring its own doom, and in doing so, find a path to freedom no one had ever imagined? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Georgia sun was a merciless tyrant, beating down upon the cotton fields of Oak Haven Plantation with a white, shimmering intensity. The air, thick enough to drink, hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of magnolias blooming near the main house. Heat radiated from the ground in visible waves, distorting the horizon and making the distant line of trees tremble. It was a world painted in stark contrasts. The brilliant green of the cotton leaves against the rich, dark soil, the endless rows of bent backs moving with a pained, rhythmic slowness. In the distance, the Beaumont house stood as a monument to this suffering, its colossal white pillars and sprawling verandas, a pristine, arrogant rebuke to the toil that sustained it. Closer, nestled beside a grove of ancient, weeping oaks, stood the old chapel, its stone walls stained dark with age and choked by a relentless tide of ivy. Clara Daniels worked in the shade of the main house, tending to the delicate roses in Mrs. Beaumont's prized garden. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency, each snip of her shears precise, each weed pulled with a fluid grace that rendered her nearly invisible to the casual observer. She was a woman wrapped in silence, her face a placid mask that betrayed nothing of the churning thoughts within. Her hands, though calloused from a life of servitude, were deft and gentle among the fragile petals. Then came the sound that governed their lives. The chapel bell began to toll, its bronze voice rolling across the fields, a familiar resonant clang that marked the hour. 1, 2, 3. The workers in the field straightened their aching backs, their faces turning towards the sound, their bodies conditioned to its command. 4, 5, 6. Clara's hands stilled. She did not look towards the fields or the grand house, but to the source of the sound, the old bell tower. 7, 8, 9. Her gaze was sharp, analytical. She noted the way the tower, built of riverstone and ambition, seemed to lean ever so slightly to the west, as if tired of its long vigil. The ivy, once a decorative touch, had become a predator, its thick, woody vines worming into the mortar, prying the stones apart with a slow, patient violence. 10, 11, 12. Midday. The final toll hung in the humid air, a long, vibrating hum that seemed to settle into the very bones of the land. Clara felt the bell more than she heard it. It was the metronome of her bondage, each ring a measure of her life being counted away for the profit of another. Yet, behind the mask of quiet compliance, her mind was a fortress of observation. She knew the tower's secrets. She had seen how the summer rains pooled at its base, softening the earth, She had heard the groans of its ancient timbers on windy nights, a sound like an old man shifting in his sleep. The bell itself had changed over the years, its once clear voice now carrying a deeper, more mournful tone, as if the bronze had absorbed the sorrow of the land it lorded over. A shadow fell over her. "Get back to it, girl," a harsh voice grated. Mr. Harding, the overseer, stood there, his face flushed with the heat, his eyes small and suspicious. "That bell ain't ringing for you to rest." Clara offered no argument, no flicker of defiance in her eyes. She simply gave a slight, deferential nod and turned back to the roses, her hands resuming their work as if the interruption had never occurred. Harding watched her for a moment longer, a frustrated grunt escaping his lips before he moved on, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Clara's expression remained unchanged, but her focus had sharpened. The image of the ivy-choked tower burned into her mind, as evening bled across the sky in hues of bruised purple and soft orange. A measure of peace settled over the slave quarters. The oppressive heat of the day relented, replaced by a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves and carried the chirping of crickets. The air was filled with the low murmur of conversation, the scent of wood smoke, and the aroma of meager evening meals being prepared. Clara sat on a small three-legged stool outside a cabin, sharing a bowl of corn mush with Elias. He was an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes holding a deep, weary wisdom. He had been born at Oak Haven, and his memory stretched back through generations of Beaumonts. He watched as Clara, even while eating, let her gaze drift across the darkening fields to where the chapel stood, a jagged silhouette against the fading light. "You stare at that tower like you're trying to see right through it, child," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Clara brought her attention back to him, a faint, fleeting smile touching her lips. "I was just listening, Elias. The wind makes a strange sound through the slats tonight." Elias chewed his food slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was barely audible above the crickets. "Some sounds are best left unheard. They say that bell has a soul, a tired one, and when a soul gets tired enough, it might just do something unexpected." He paused, looking around to ensure no one else was listening. "Long ago, my grandmother told me a story her mother told her. She said that if the bell ever tolls a 13th time, it ain't for the living to hear. It's a call for the spirits, a signal to open a door between this world and the next." The old man's words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of generations. It was a piece of folklore, a superstition born from hardship, and a need for a magic greater than their own suffering. But in the deepening twilight, with the dark shape of the tower looming in the distance, the story felt real. It planted a seed in the fertile ground of Clara's quiet curiosity. The tower was not just a symbol of her oppression, but perhaps something more. A door. Elias's tone was not that of a man telling a fanciful tale. It was one of genuine fear and reverence, a warning as much as a story. Clara said nothing, but her gaze returned to the tower, no longer seeing just stone and ivy, but a place of potent, dangerous possibility. Later that night, the air in the Beaumonts' dining room was stale, with the scent of roasted meat and entitlement. Clara moved like a ghost around the polished mahogany table, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only when a need arose. Mr. Beaumont, a portly man with a perpetually dissatisfied expression, was complaining about the cost of a new roof for the main barn. His wife, a pale, nervous woman, draped in expensive silks, fanned herself languidly, her rings glittering in the candlelight. "That old chapel is becoming an eyesore, dear," Mrs. Beaumont said, her voice thin and reedy. "The ivy is simply pulling the stones apart, and the bell, it sounds so mournful lately. It quite gives me a chill." Mr. Beaumont waved a dismissive hand, a piece of glistening ham held aloft on his fork. "It stood for 50 years. It will stand for 50 more. It serves its purpose, reminding everyone of their duties and God's order. A little mournful sound is good for their souls." Mr. Harding, who had been invited to dine with the family to report on the week's productivity, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The hands are getting restless," he said, his voice a low growl, whispering old stories, superstitious nonsense. "A firm hand is needed. Keep their minds on their work and off of foolishness." The conversation drifted to cotton prices, to a planned trip to Savannah, to the perceived laziness of the field hands. Clara listened to it all, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. They spoke of the chapel's decay as an inconvenience, an aesthetic problem. They knew the tower was weakening, that the ivy was a destructive force, but they saw it only through the lens of utility and cost. They were blind to the tower's soul, deaf to the stories it told. Clara absorbed the information, filing it away in the silent library of her mind. The masters saw a tool of control. The overseer saw a source of unrest, and Elias saw a gateway for spirits. But Clara, standing in the shadows of their opulence, was beginning to see something else entirely. She was beginning to see a weakness, a flaw in the architecture of her prison, and as she poured Mr. Beaumont another glass of deep red wine, the cold, indifferent conversation of her captors became another piece of a puzzle that was slowly, terrifyingly, taking shape in her mind. The lines of power were clear, but so were the cracks in the foundation. The hours after midnight crept by, each one heavier and more suffocating than the last. A strange and profound stillness had fallen over Oakhaven, a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The usual nocturnal chorus of crickets and frogs had ceased, and not a single leaf stirred on the ancient oaks. The moon, which should have been nearing its zenith, was completely smothered by a thick, seamless blanket of cloud, plunging the world into an inky, featureless black. The air was a hot, wet blanket, so humid it felt as if the sky were sweating, and the whole plantation seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a storm that refused to break. In the slave quarters, sleep was a fickle visitor. Men and women tossed on their thin pallets, their bodies slick with perspiration, their minds unsettled by the oppressive quiet. They felt it in their bones, the same way they could feel an approaching frost or a coming fever. On the small porch of his cabin, Elias sat perfectly still on his stool, his old eyes fixed on the spot in the darkness where he knew the chapel tower stood. He wasn't looking with his eyes, but with his memory, his spirit, a silent vigil kept against a nameless dread. In the great house, Mrs. Beaumont was wide awake, her silk nightgown clinging to her skin. She fanned herself with a frantic, useless energy, her ears straining against the silence, her nerves stretched to a breaking point. She kept imagining sounds, a floorboard creaking, a distant whisper, but there was nothing, and the nothing was worse than any noise. Miles away, it seemed, Mr. Harding made his late-night rounds, his lantern carving a lonely, swinging circle of light in the profound dark. A permanent scowl was etched onto his face, his suspicions stoked by the unnatural calm. He felt a loss of control, as if the very air were defying his authority, and it made his temper simmer. He walked past the rows of silent cabins, his boots crunching softly on the dirt path. He peered into the bunkhouse where the unmarried women slept, his lantern light sweeping across the sleeping forms. He counted them out of habit, his lips moving silently. One was missing. He scanned the room again, his eyes narrowing. It was Clara's bunk, empty, the thin blanket folded neatly at its base. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. She was likely in the privy, or perhaps tending to a sick friend. Still, it was a break in the routine, another small tear in the fabric of order he so brutally maintained. He made a mental note to find her, to make an example of her for being out of her place, and continued his patrol, the lantern light shrinking as he moved away, leaving the empty bunk in darkness once more. Then the sound began. It did not startle so much as it pierced, a single, resonant toll that cut through the thick, silent air with impossible clarity. It was the chapel bell, but it was wrong. The tone was deeper, more powerful than anyone had ever heard it, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. In the quarters, people sat bolt upright, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They began to count, their lips forming the numbers in a collective fearful whisper. 2, 3. The sound rolled across the fields. Not just a noise, but a vibration that hummed in their teeth and bones. 4, 5, 6. Mr. Harding stopped dead in his tracks, his head snapping up to stare at the invisible tower. His mind, a rigid ledger of rules and schedules, struggled to comprehend. It was not the hour. It was not any hour. 7, 8, 9. In the main house, Mr. Beaumont was jolted from a shallow, sweaty sleep, a curse forming on his lips. He thought it was a dream, a nightmare of disorder. Beside him, Mrs. Beaumont let out a small, terrified gasp, sitting bolt upright in their massive bed, her hand flying to her chest as if to keep her heart from bursting out. 10, 11. The whispers in the cabins grew louder, a chorus of disbelief and dawning. Supernatural terror. They all knew the legend. They all knew what came after 12. TWELV. A profound pause followed the 12th toll. The entire world seemed to hang suspended in that single, silent moment. Every soul at Oakhaven, master and slave alike, held their breath, their ears straining, praying not to hear what they knew was coming. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, for a heartbeat, for an eternity. Then it came. Bong. The 13th toll was not like the others. It was a cataclysm of sound, a deafening, mournful cry that was both a scream and a sob. It did not fade but seemed to shatter the air, the sound waves visibly rippling the puddles left from a morning shower. It was a sound of finality, a sound of judgment, a sound that spoke of broken chains and open doors. It shook the very foundations of the plantation. a prophecy fulfilled in a deafening, terrifying peal of bronze. The echo of the 13th toll had not yet faded when a new sound began, a sound far more terrible than the bell. It started as a low, guttural groan, the sound of immense pressure, of ancient timbers giving way. It was the tower itself, speaking its pain. The groan was joined by a horrifying grinding, the sound of stone being scraped from stone, of mortar turning to dust after decades of holding on. The noise grew with terrifying speed, escalating from a groan to a roar, a deafening crescendo of destruction. Harding, who had been frozen 50 yards from the chapel, was spurred into action by pure instinct. He threw himself backward, stumbling and falling as the ground beneath him began to tremble violently. From the windows of the main house and the doorways of the cabins, dozens of eyes watched in stunned, silent horror. The tower, a black shape against a blacker sky, began to sway. It moved not like a structure of stone, but like a living thing in its death throes. For a moment, it seemed to twist, the thick shrouds of ivy ripping away from the stone. And then, with a final, explosive roar, it imploded. The walls collapsed inward, the great bell plunging down through the splintering floors, the entire structure folding in on itself in a chaotic, thunderous avalanche of rock and wood. A colossal cloud of dust, thick and choking, erupted into the night, momentarily blotting out even the darkness. The ground shook as if struck by a giant's fist, the impact rolling through the earth, rattling the windows in the main house and shaking the foundations of the cabins. The deafening roar echoed once across the silent fields, and then it was over. A new silence fell, deeper and more profound than before, broken only by the soft, settling whisper of falling dust and the distant, panicked whinny of a horse in the stables. The symbol of order, the heart of the plantation's cruel rhythm, was gone, reduced to a pile of unseen rubble in the dark. In the silence, 100 different thoughts bloomed. There was awe, there was terror, and in the slave quarters, hidden behind masks of fear, there was a spark of something else, a secret, fearful sense of triumph. The impossible had happened. The bell had sung its own doom. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and gray, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Where the proud bell tower had stood for half a century, there was now only a mountain of rubble, a chaotic jumble of shattered stones, splintered beams, and twisted metal. The great bronze bell was partially visible, its lip buried in the earth, a jagged crack running through its side like a frozen bolt of lightning. A fine, pale dust coated everything. The leaves of the oaks, the grass, the roof of the nearby chapel, giving the world a ghostly, ashen pallor. Mr. Beaumont stood before the ruins, his face purple with a rage that seemed to vibrate in the still morning air. This was not an act of God. In his mind, this was an act of insurrection. It was a message, a challenge to his absolute authority, and he would not abide it. A head count, he bellowed, his voice hoarse with fury. I want a head count now. I want to know who was near this, who is responsible for this mess. The overseers, led by a grim-faced Harding, moved with a brutal efficiency, their shouts and curses echoing in the unsettled morning. They stormed through the quarters, kicking open doors, shoving people out into the open, their whips cracking for emphasis. Names were called from lists, each person accounted for, their faces a mixture of fear and a carefully guarded blankness. They checked the fields, the barns, the kitchens. The count came up short. One person was missing. Harding, his face caked with dust and his eyes burning with a sleepless fire, strode back to where Beaumont was waiting, his fists clenched at his sides. "She's not in her cabin," Harding reported, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not in the fields. We've looked everywhere. It's Clara. She's gone." Beaumont stared at him, his mind refusing to connect the two events. "Gone? What do you mean gone? Did she run? Was she crushed in that mess?" He gestured angrily at the pile of rubble. "If she ran, we'll find her. If she's in there, dig her out. I want her found." The mystery of the 13th toll and the collapsed tower was instantly eclipsed by a new, more tangible mystery: the disappearance of Clara Daniels. For the masters, the two events were linked by suspicion and the presumption of guilt. She had sabotaged the tower and used the chaos to flee, a crime for which the punishment would be biblical. But in the quarters, as the enslaved people were herded towards the rubble and ordered to begin the impossible task of clearing it, another story was being born. They exchanged furtive, meaningful glances, their eyes communicating what their lips dared not. Elias looked at the ruins, then at the empty sky, and a slow, profound understanding dawned in his old eyes. Clara was gone. The bell had tolled 13 times. The tower had fallen. It was not a coincidence. It was a fulfillment. They did not know how, but they knew, with a certainty that resonated deeper than Beaumont's rage or Harding's threats, that Clara had not simply run. She had ascended. The door had opened, and she had stepped through, leaving a world of chains behind for a freedom they could only imagine. The masters were looking for a runaway, but the people of Oakhaven had already begun to search for a legend. The work of clearing the rubble began under a sky the color of ash. Harding, his face a mask of grim fury, drove the men with a relentless, venomous energy. He was a man possessed, his authority having been so profoundly mocked that he could only respond with brute force. He stalked the perimeter of the devastation. His whip coiled in his hand like a sleeping serpent, his voice a constant, grating lash against the men's spirits. "Faster!" His voice cracking with rage. "I want her found. She'll not make a fool of me and get away with it. Move this trash." The men, a collection of field hands and artisans dragged from their morning tasks, moved with a pained slowness. They shoveled broken stone, heaved splintered timbers, their bodies aching under the strain and the renewed heat of the day. But their slowness was not just from exhaustion. A thick, unspoken reverence hung over the site. This was not a simple pile of rubble. It was a tomb, a monument, a place where something impossible had happened. Each stone they moved felt sacred. Each piece of wood. Their deliberate pace was a subtle, silent act of resistance, a funereal procession disguised as labor, a quiet tribute to the woman who had vanished into the heart of the mystery. Elias was among them, his old back protesting with every stone he lifted. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes were alive with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He worked beside the younger men, his presence a steadying, silent force. He knew they were not looking for a body. They were dismantling a miracle. Mr. Beaumont arrived on horseback, his portly frame rigid with indignation. He did not dismount, choosing to loom over the scene from his elevated position, a king surveying a wound in his kingdom. "It was an act of sabotage, Harding," he declared, his voice carrying across the sight. "A calculated, venomous act of defiance. She'll be found, and she will be dealt with in a manner that no one here will ever forget." He glared down at the workers, his eyes sweeping over them with contempt, as if their very existence were an affront. The men did not look up. They simply continued their work, their faces turned to the dust and the debris. The air grew thick with more than just dust. It was choked with tension, a palpable, vibrating hatred between the man on the horse and the men on the ground. Harding's rage was a hot, explosive thing, but Beaumont's was cold and absolute, the fury of a god whose temple had been defiled. The day wore on, a grueling, monotonous cycle of lifting and carrying. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the ruins, the white dust reflecting its glare, until the men's eyes burned. The great bronze bell, a monstrous silent casualty, became more exposed as the rubble around it was cleared. Its cracked surface seemed to weep in the heat. A fallen monarch stripped of its voice and its crown. Harding's frustration grew with every passing hour that yielded no discovery. He saw conspiracy in the men's slow movements, insolence in their averted eyes. He cracked his whip against a pile of stones, the sound sharp and vicious, making them all flinch. "I want her found," he screamed, his voice raw. "Dead or alive, I want her found." But the men knew, in a place deeper than fear, that they would find neither. Clara was not in the rubble. She was in the air, in the silence, in the story that was already beginning to be told in the spaces between the ringing of their shovels against the stone. The discovery came late in the afternoon, when the sun was beginning its long, slow descent, and the shadows of the remaining oaks stretched like dark fingers across the ruins. A young man named Joseph, his arms trembling with fatigue, heaved away a massive, splintered beam that had been part of the tower's main support. It shifted with a groan and a cloud of plaster dust, revealing a cavity beneath, a dark space close to the cracked half-buried bell. And in that space, something moved. It was just a flicker of color, a small piece of cloth fluttering in the slight breeze created by the shifting of the timber. Joseph froze, his shovel held halfway to the next load. He stared, his mouth slightly agape. Elias, working a few feet away, saw the boy's stillness. He followed his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. He knew that color. He knew that pattern. Before he could speak or move, Harding was there, his shadow falling over them both. "What is it? What do you see?" he snarled, shoving Joseph aside with a violent thrust. He peered into the darkness, his eyes narrowing. He saw it then. He reached down, his hand disappearing into the cavity, and when he brought it back up, he was holding it. A simple cotton kerchief, its floral pattern faded from the sun and countless washings. A small, neat patch in one corner where a tear had been mended. It was Clara's. But it was not just lying there, caught in the wreckage. It was tied, with a firm, deliberate knot, to the thick, frayed end of the bell rope. It was not an accident. It was a signature. A profound, absolute silence fell over the work crew. The scrape of shovels, the grunts of effort, the murmur of voices, all of it ceased. Every eye was fixed on the small piece of cloth held in the overseer's hand. It was a flag, a testament, a final, defiant word. Harding stared at it, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. The initial triumph of finding a clue warred with a dawning, infuriating confusion. This changed everything. A runaway might drop something in her haste. A victim might have a piece of clothing torn away. But this was a statement. This was an act of intention. Her, he whispered. The word a puff of air. He held it up for Beaumont, who had since dismounted and was watching from a short distance. It's hers. She was here. He turned his gaze from the kerchief to the broken bell, then back to the impossible knot. A horrifying, unbelievable logic began to form in his mind. She did this. The words were spoken with a dawning, chilling certainty. He was not speaking of the supernatural. He was speaking of a slave woman, a quiet, unassuming woman, who had somehow, and possibly, brought a 50-foot stone tower crashing to the ground and then vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only this small, impossible token. For Harding and Beaumont, it was the ultimate act of insolence, a crime so audacious it bordered on madness. But for the enslaved men standing frozen in the dust, it was something else entirely. It was the confirmation of a miracle. The kerchief was not a clue. It was a relic, proof that Clara had not been a victim of the tower's fall, but the agent of it. She had not been crushed beneath the stone. She had commanded it. She had rung the bell her own way, a final, thundering toll of liberation, and left this piece of herself behind to tell the tale. That night, the air in the quarters was not one of mourning, but of a hushed, electric excitement. The exhaustion of the day was forgotten, replaced by a restless, vibrant energy that crackled in the darkness. Fear was still present, a constant companion, but it was now mingled with something new and powerful, wonder. People did not stay in their own cabins, but gathered in small, secret clusters in the deepest shadows, their voices low and urgent, their eyes wide in the faint moonlight. The story of the kerchief had spread like wildfire, passed in whispers, in glances, in a shared, unspoken understanding. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the physical proof that transformed a strange event into a legend. At the center of the largest group, near the ancient, gnarled roots of a cypress tree, sat Elias. He was no longer just a respected elder. He was an oracle, the keeper of the sacred text. The people leaned in close, their faces illuminated by the faint, flickering light of a single, hidden candle. Their breath held as he spoke. He retold the story his grandmother had told him, the story of the 13th toll, but it was different now. It was no longer a vague piece of folklore, a cautionary tale about spirits and doorways. It was the story of Clara. She didn't run from the tower, Elias said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate with the truth of his words. She climbed it. She climbed it like a ladder to the sky. She didn't break her chains. She rang them into dust. He looked around at the faces watching him, seeing their hope, their fear, their desperate need to believe. The masters, they think she pulled it down to run. They are fools. They see the body, but they don't see the soul. The 13th toll wasn't a warning. It was her chariot, come to take her home. She rang that bell, and the sound opened a door for her that no man can shut. A young woman, her eyes shining with unshed tears, leaned forward. So, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. So, she's free? Elias turned his ancient knowing eyes to her. A slow, sad and beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile that held all the sorrow of his years and all the hope of this one impossible night. "Child," he said, his voice soft but firm, a rock in a swirling sea of uncertainty. "She is freer than any of us can imagine." The words settled over them, a benediction and a promise. The myth of Clara was born in that moment, fully formed and radiant. She was not a runaway hiding in a swamp, fearing the dogs and the hunters. She was an icon, a folk hero, a supernatural force who had not merely escaped her bondage, but had transcended it, striking a blow against the very symbol of her oppression and ascending into legend. The story gave them a hero, but it also gave them a language, a way to articulate the depth of their own yearning for a freedom so complete it was divine. Clara, the quiet woman who tended the roses, had become Saint Clara of the Bell, and her story was a prayer whispered in the dark, a spark of light that even Harding's fury could not extinguish. The weeks bled into a month, and the raw wound on the landscape where the tower had stood began to scar over. The last of the rubble was hauled away, the ground raked clean, leaving a bare, circular patch of earth that felt more conspicuous in its emptiness than the tower had in its looming presence. It was a void, a missing tooth in the plantation's grim smile, and it drew the eye with a magnetic pull. The masters tried to ignore it, to act as if the space had always been empty, but the effort was a strain. The silence left by the bell was a constant, unnerving presence. The rigid punctuation of their days was gone, replaced by an amorphous, unsettling quiet that made every rustle of leaves, every distant shout, seem amplified and significant. For the enslaved, the empty space became a shrine. One morning, a single, bright yellow wildflower appeared in the center of the circle. Harding found it on his morning patrol, his face twisting into a mask of contempt. He ground it into the dirt with the heel of his boot, a small, vicious act of erasure. But the next morning, 2 more flowers were in its place. He destroyed them as well, his anger simmering. But the following day, a small, carefully arranged spray of purple verbena lay on the spot. He could not stand guard over the empty patch of earth all night, and he could not whip every person on the plantation. The small, silent offerings continued, a persistent, gentle defiance that he was powerless to stop. The rebellion was not just in flowers. It was in the air itself, carried on the notes of their music. The work songs, those ancient, mournful melodies that had scored the rhythm of their labor for generations, began to change. A new verse, soft and subtle, wove its way into the familiar refrains. It was never sung loudly, never when an overseer was close enough to distinguish the words clearly, but it was there, a current beneath the surface. They sang of a woman who climbed a wooden mountain, a woman who rang a starry bell, a woman who wore a kerchief of flowers and flew away home. The words were poetic, allegorical, just deniable enough to offer a sliver of protection. But everyone, master and slave alike, knew who the song was about. It was Clara's song, and it turned her memory into a living, breathing presence in the fields. Her name became a charm, a mischievous spirit invoked to explain the small misfortunes of daily life. When a hoe handle snapped under the strain of the hard clay soil, a worker might mutter under his breath, "Clara's work." When a bucket of water was accidentally spilled on the porch of the main house, a house girl might whisper to another, Clara's feelin' playful today. It was a way of claiming a small measure of power, of attributing the random cruelties and accidents of their existence to a friendly, powerful agent who was still, in some way, on their side. These small acts, these flowers and songs and whispers, were like the ivy that had once choked the tower. Each one was small and seemingly insignificant, but together they created an atmosphere of simmering, indomitable resistance, a web of memory and myth that the masters could feel tightening around them, even if they could not see its threads. The unease seeped through the walls of the great house, a miasma that settled most heavily on Mrs. Beaumont. Her already fragile nerves began to fray and unravel. The silence left by the bell had become, for her, a canvas onto which her anxious mind painted terrifying sounds. She complained of hearing a faint ringing in her ears, a ghostly echo of the 13th toll that would jolt her from her sleep. She started at shadows, convinced she saw a fleeting figure in the long hallways of the house, the ghost of a quiet woman in a faded floral kerchief. The entire plantation, once a place of absolute order and security for her, now felt haunted. Her complaints fell on the deaf ears of her husband, who saw any admission of fear as a contemptible weakness. Yet, Mr. Beaumont was not immune. He felt the shift not in ghostly sounds, but in the cold, hard numbers in his ledger. Productivity, which he measured with an almost religious fervor, had dipped. It was not a dramatic drop, nothing he could pin on a single cause, but it was there, a slow, steady decline. The pace of work in the fields was subtly slower, the yield from the cotton gin marginally less. It was the result of 1,000 tiny moments of distraction, of a community whose collective mind was not entirely on its work, but on a story, on a song, on a patch of empty earth. One evening, as they sat in the stifling formality of their dining room, the silence between them thick and heavy, Mrs. Beaumont finally broke. "It's this place," she said, her voice a thin, trembling whisper. She stared at her untouched plate of food, her hands twisting a silk napkin in her lap. "It feels haunted now. Her memory is everywhere, in the fields, in the house, everywhere. I feel like she's watching us." Mr. Beaumont slammed his fork down onto the table, the silver clattering against the fine china. "Nonsense," he boomed, his face flushing with anger. "It is superstitious talk from the quarters. Nothing more. It is a sickness of the mind, and it is spreading because Harding has allowed it to. He has been too soft. He will put a stop to it." But his words were hollow, a blustering defense against a fear he also felt. They were losing control, not to an open rebellion of fire and violence, but to the power of a story they could not kill, a ghost they could not chain. Their sense of absolute security, the very foundation upon which their world was built, was eroding, being eaten away not by an army, but by the memory of a single, quiet woman. The haunting of Oakhaven was not about a spirit lingering in the shadows. It was about the terrifying realization that the people they owned had a rich, secret world of their own, a world where they had heroes and saints, and where the masters were merely the villains in a story of liberation. Harding felt this shift more acutely than anyone. His authority, once absolute, now felt conditional, mocked by unseen forces. The whispers that ceased the moment he approached, the eyes that dropped to the ground but held a flicker of something other than fear, the cursed wildflowers that reappeared each morning, All of it was a personal affront. His frustration, left to simmer for weeks, finally boiled over on a blisteringly hot afternoon in the cotton fields. He was riding his horse between the rows, the sun beating down on his neck, his mood as foul as the stagnant air. And then he heard it. It was not a whisper, but a clear, soft hum. A young man named Peter, his back bent to his work, was humming the melody of Clara's song. It was a quiet, almost unconscious act, a private comfort in the midst of his toil. But to Harding, it was a trumpet call of defiance. He reined his horse in so sharply that the animal reared, its hooves pawing at the air. "You!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Peter. "What was that? What were you humming?" Peter froze, his face draining of color. He looked up at the overseer, his eyes wide with terror. "Nothing, Master Harding," he stammered. "Just a tune." "A tune?" Harding dismounted in a single, fluid motion, his face a mask of pure rage. He strode towards Peter, ripping the whip from his belt. "You think I'm a fool? I know that tune." He grabbed the front of Peter's thin shirt, yanking him upright. The other workers in the field stopped, their bodies frozen, a collective gasp of fear rippling through them. Harding shoved Peter towards the end of the row, where a large oak stood, its branches offering a mocking shade. He tied the young man's hands to a low, thick branch, his movements rough and efficient. The whipping was brutal and methodical. Harding poured all of his accumulated rage and paranoia into each swing of the leather, the sickening crack of the whip echoing across the silent fields. He was not just punishing one man for humming a song. He was trying to beat the ghost of Clara out of the very air. When it was over, and Peter was a sobbing, broken heap on the ground, Harding turned to face the assembled workers. His chest was heaving, his face slick with sweat, his eyes burning with a wild, fanatical light. He held the whip, its tip now dark with blood, and pointed it at them. "There is no Clara," he screamed, his voice raw and cracking. "Do you hear me? There was a runaway slave who was a fool and got herself killed in a storm. She is dust. She is nothing." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze sweeping over their terrified faces, daring any one of them to meet his eye. "The next person who speaks her name, the next person who sings her song, the next person who leaves a flower on that cursed ground, will wish they were dust too. Her name is forbidden. Her memory is forbidden. You will forget her." He stood there for a long moment, letting his threat hang in the thick, heavy air. Then he turned, untied Peter's limp form, and stalked back to his horse, leaving a profound and terrible silence in his wake. But his violence had the opposite effect of what he intended. The brutal whipping did not break their spirit. It galvanized it. It did not erase Clara's memory. It sanctified it. In his desperate attempt to suppress the myth, Harding had only made it more powerful. By forbidding her name, he had made it sacred. By punishing those who remembered her, he cemented his own role as the profane villain in the hallowed story of St. Clara. The workers who carried Peter back to the quarters that evening did so with a new, hardened resolve in their hearts. They had seen more than just Harding's cruelty. They had seen his fear, and in his fear, they found a sliver of their own power. The ghost of Clara was no longer just a comforting spirit. She was now a warrior, and they were her silent, secret army. Late that night, long after the cries of Peter had faded, and a sullen, fearful quiet had once again descended upon the quarters. Elias sat alone in his cabin. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of pine smoke and the lingering metallic tang of blood and fear. He held a small object in the palm of his hand, turning it over and over in the flickering candlelight. It was a bird, carved from a piece of soft pine, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Its surface was worn smooth from years of handling. It was the last thing Clara had given him. A silent promise passed between them months before the tower fell. As he stared at the wooden bird, the carefully constructed myth he presented to the world dissolved, replaced by the sharp, clear memory of the real Clara, a woman whose mind was as sharp and dangerous as any blade. He remembered a conversation months ago, while they were pulling weeds from the vegetable patch behind the kitchens. She had looked not at the weeds, but at a thick root of an oak tree that was cracking the stone wall of the smokehouse. "Elias, you know plants," she had said, her voice as low and soft as always, yet underpinned with a strange intensity. "Which root grows strongest in rock? The one that pushes hard, or the one that finds the cracks?" He had given her a simple answer then, about the patience of water and roots, not understanding the true nature of her question. Now, he saw it clearly. She had not been asking about gardening. She was studying destruction. Another memory surfaced, this one from a cool evening when she had been tasked with dusting the books in Mr. Beaumont's library. Elias had been called in to mend a broken chair. He saw her standing before a large open book, her finger tracing the intricate lines of a diagram. She had not noticed him at first. Her concentration was so absolute. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a light he had never seen before. "I saw the master's books on architecture," she whispered to him later, as they walked back towards the quarters in the gathering dusk. "He leaves them open, so many numbers and lines, showing how things stand up." She had paused, her gaze drifting towards the distant silhouette of the chapel tower. "They also show how things fall down." He had felt a chill then, a prickle of fear at the implication in her words, but he had pushed it away as fanciful. It was too audacious, too impossible to contemplate. He, like everyone else, had seen only her quiet compliance, her mask of servitude. He had not recognized the keen, analytical mind hiding behind it, a mind that was secretly devouring the knowledge of her oppressors and turning it into a weapon. The final memory was the most chilling, the one that now formed the foundation of the legend he so carefully nurtured. They had been caught in a sudden downpour a few weeks before the collapse, taking shelter in a disused barn. A strong gust of wind had rattled the old structure, and a large rotten beam overhead had groaned ominously. Clara had looked up at it, her face calm and assessing. "A heavy rain, a strong wind," she had murmured, almost to herself. "A rope pulled just right. A thing that looks strong is only as strong as its weakest point." Elias closed his hand around the small wooden bird, the smooth wood a comfort against his calloused skin. He had been her confidant, the only one to whom she had revealed these small, scattered pieces of her true self. He had not understood then that she was giving him the blueprint of her escape, trusting him to assemble the pieces after she was gone. And in the aftermath, when the tower lay in ruins and the people looked to him for answers, he had made a choice. The truth was a dangerous, complicated thing. The truth was that Clara was a genius, a brilliant engineer of her own liberation, who had committed an act of sabotage so profound it bordered on sorcery. To reveal that truth would be to invite a wave of terror and investigation that could tear their fragile community apart. It would put them all under suspicion. The legend, however, was a shield. The story of a supernatural event, of a spirit door opening, was something the masters could dismiss as superstitious nonsense, even as it unnerved them. It was a story they could not fight, a ghost they could not hang. The legend gave the people hope, a hero, a miracle to cling to in the darkness. The truth could get them all killed. The legend could help them survive. So Elias, the keeper of Clara's secret, became the architect of her myth, protecting the memory of her brilliant mind by cloaking it in the power of a spirit. He held the bird to his chest, a silent promise to the woman who had flown away, a promise to keep her real story safe by telling the greatest lie of his life. The plan had been a seed planted long ago, nurtured in secret and watered with patient observation. It began in the dark of the moon, weeks before the collapse, when Clara would slip from her bunk and move like a ghost through the sleeping plantation. Her destination was always the same: the west wall of the bell tower, the side that bore the brunt of the wind and rain, the side where the ivy grew thickest. She carried with her a tool of her own making, a shard of granite, its edge painstakingly sharpened against a harder stone. Night after night, she worked in the deep shadows, her small form pressed against the cold, damp wall. Her task was one of meticulous, patient destruction. She did not hammer or strike, for the noise would betray her. Instead, she scraped. With the sharp edge of the granite, she attacked the mortar between the river stones at the tower's base, chipping away at the crumbling mixture of sand and lime in a key structural point she had identified from the diagrams in Beaumont's book. The work was slow, agonizing. Each night, she would manage to remove only a handful of the decaying mortar, hiding the small pile of dust and grit under the thick leaves of the ivy. Her fingers grew raw, her muscles ached with the strain of the repetitive motion, and her ears were constantly straining for the sound of Harding's patrols. The fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but her focus was absolute. She was a surgeon, cutting away at the tendon of her enemy, while she physically weakened the tower. She also studied its other vulnerabilities. She became a student of the weather, learning the feel of the air before a heavy rain, the direction of the wind by the sway of the tallest pines. She needed the ground to be soft, the earth around the foundation saturated and weak. She watched the sky, waiting for the right pattern, a series of storms that would do part of her work for her. Her laboratory was a small, abandoned shed on the far edge of the property, a place no one ever went. There, she found a thick, rotted beam, half eaten by termites. She spent hours studying it, testing its fragility, learning how a seemingly solid piece of wood could be compromised from within. She experimented with leverage, using a smaller piece of wood to see how much pressure it took to crack the larger beam, internalizing the physics of collapse. Her final acquisition was the most crucial. Deep in the woods that bordered the plantation, where the slaves were sometimes sent to gather firewood, she found what she was looking for: a thick, supple vine of muscadine, as strong and fibrous as any rope. She spent an entire afternoon hacking it free, her hands bleeding from the effort. She coiled the precious length of vine, nearly 30 feet of it, and dragged it back, hiding it in a hollow log near the chapel, a place she could retrieve it from when the time was right. She knew the old bell rope was unreliable, likely to snap under the unusual strain she intended to put on it. Her plan required the bell to be rung, but not for long. It was all a calculation, a terrifyingly precise equation of decay, weather, and force. The 13th toll was not a number of supernatural significance. It was simply her count, the number of pulls she estimated it would take for the weakened structure, on softened ground, to finally surrender. The night of the collapse, the air was just as she had calculated. Thick, wet, and still. The precursor to a violent thunderstorm. She moved through the oppressive darkness, her bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. There was no fear in her heart now, only a cold, clear focus, the calm of a hunter closing in on her prey. She did not go to the base of the tower to pull the main rope. That was too exposed, too obvious. Instead, she slipped into the chapel itself, through a loose board in the back wall she had discovered months prior. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and decay. A single arched window, its glass long since shattered, was set into the wall that connected to the tower, about 10 feet from the floor. From here, the bell rope was accessible as it descended from the belfry above. She retrieved her hidden vine. With the agility of a squirrel, she scaled the rough stone wall, finding purchase in the gaps between the stones. Reaching the window, she straddled the opening, her body half in and half out of the tower. She worked quickly, her fingers sure and steady as she tied her thick vine to the bell rope, creating a new, stronger pulley system. She fed the end of the vine back through the window and down to the chapel floor. She was ready. Before she descended, she performed her final, calculated act. From a small pouch at her waist, she took out her kerchief. She tied it firmly to the bell rope, just above the knot she had made with the vine. It was her signature, her claim of authorship on the destruction she was about to unleash. It was the one piece of the puzzle she wanted them to find. Dropping back to the chapel floor, she took the end of the vine in both hands. She took a deep breath and pulled. The sound of the first toll was deafening in the enclosed space. She did not pause. Again, she pulled, putting her back and legs into it, a rhythm of destruction. 2, 3, 4. The tower, already weakened, began to protest. A low groan vibrating through the stone walls of the chapel. 5, 6, 7. She could feel the resistance in the rope changing. A new slackness, a terrifying shudder. 8, 9, 10. The groans were louder now, joined by the sickening crunch of splintering wood from above. 11, 12. She paused for a single, heart-stopping moment. Gathering all of her strength, she looked once more at the darkness, towards the river, towards the north. Then, with a final desperate cry that was lost in the noise, she threw all of her weight into the 13th pull. The sound of the final toll was instantly consumed by a deafening roar as the tower began its final spectacular death. But Clara was not there to see it. The moment she felt the rope go completely slack, the moment the cataclysm began, she was already running. She did not run towards the quarters. She did not run towards the chaos. She ran away from it, a silent shadow melting into the deeper shadows of the woods. The crash, The dust, the confusion, the screams. It was all part of her plan. It was the greatest distraction in the world. The perfect cover for a single woman to vanish from the face of the earth. The tower fell, and in its fall, it erased her trail completely, leaving behind only a legend, a mystery, and a single, faded floral kerchief tied to a broken rope. The years fell away like stones into a deep well, and the world turned over. The war came and went, a storm of fire and cannon smoke that scoured the land and left it irrevocably changed. By 1870, Oak Haven Plantation was a ghost of its former self. The great house still stood, but its white pillars were stained with mildew and its paint was peeling away in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin. The fields, once a sea of white cotton, lay fallow and overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, a testament to a broken kingdom. The slave quarters were gone, dismantled board by board, the wood repurposed for new homes in the free township that had sprung up a mile down the river, a place built of hope and scrap lumber. On a warm autumn evening, an elderly Elias sat on the porch of a small, sturdy cabin in that township, the setting sun casting a golden glow on his face. His great-grandchildren played in the dirt yard before him, their laughter a sound of pure, unburdened freedom. One of them, a little girl with wide, curious eyes, ran to him and climbed into his lap. "Grand, Elias," she said, her small voice serious. "Tell us again. Tell us about Clara." Elias smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He looked past the small houses of the township, his gaze settling on the distant, empty patch of land where the tower had once stood, a place you could only find now if you knew exactly where to look. He had told the story 1,000 times, and each time it felt more real, more true than the complicated facts he kept locked away in his heart. "They say she flew, child," he began, his voice a low, melodic rumble, the voice of a storyteller. "They say she flew on the sound of the bell. Mr. Beaumont, he thought he owned the bell, thought he owned the sound it made. But Clara, she knew better. She knew that bell had a soul, and she taught it a new song." He bounced the child gently on his knee, his eyes distant, seeing the past as if it were yesterday. "She climbed that wooden mountain, right up to the sky, and she rang that bell 13 times. She rang it for every hour of the day, and one more for freedom. She rang the master's world down around his ears. And when the dust settled, the spirits had opened a door for her, and she just stepped right through." The other children had gathered around now, their play forgotten, their faces upturned and rapt. They had heard the story before, but they never tired of it. It was their story, their genesis. It was the first chapter in the book of their freedom. Elias had made his choice all those years ago, in the dark, bloody aftermath of Harding's fury. He had chosen the legend over the truth because he understood something profound, something Clara herself must have understood. The truth of her escape was the story of one woman's genius, a solitary act of brilliance. But the legend, the story of a woman who could command spirits and fly on the sound of a bell, that was a story that belonged to everyone. It was a story that could not be chained or whipped or sold. It was a story that whispered that freedom was not just about running. It was about ascending, about becoming something more powerful than your oppressors could ever imagine. And so, He told the legend, and in the telling, he kept the truest part of Clara's spirit alive. Decades later, in a quiet, sunlit library in Philadelphia, a young man named Marcus Thorne bent over a collection of brittle, yellowed papers. He was a historian, one of the first of his generation of black scholars, and his life's work was to gather the stories that had been left out of the official histories, the oral traditions and whispered legends of his people. He was a descendant of the Oak Haven community, his own grandmother having been one of the children who had listened, rapt, at Elias's feet. He had grown up with the myth of Clara's bell, and while he cherished it as a foundational story, his historian's mind was skeptical of its supernatural claims. He was searching for the woman behind the myth. For weeks, he had been sifting through the archives of an abolitionist society, referencing their records with the oral histories he had painstakingly collected. He found countless tales of daring escapes, of long journeys on the Underground Railroad, but nothing that matched the unique, dramatic flair of Clara's story. He was beginning to lose hope when he found it. It was a small, anonymous entry in a ledger detailing aid given to newly arrived fugitives, dated late in the year of 1848. The entry was sparse, the details deliberately vague to protect the identities of those involved. It mentioned a woman from Georgia, arriving alone and in good health, but it was the final line of the entry that made Marcus's heart stop. It noted her remarkable intelligence and the highly unusual story of her escape, which had occurred during what the writer called a conveniently timed storm and structural collapse on her plantation of origin. Marcus stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. A structural collapse. It was a thin thread, but it was a thread. He spent the next several days digging through the Society's correspondence from that period, searching for any further mention of this intelligent woman from Georgia. He finally found it, not in an official report, but in a personal letter from a Quaker woman named Sarah Pearsall to her sister. The letter was dated 1855, 7 years after the tower's fall. In it, Sarah spoke with great affection of a quiet, dignified woman named Clara, no last name was given, who worked as a seamstress in the city. Sarah wrote of Clara's incredible skill with a needle, her quick mind, and her slow but steady progress in learning to read and write. And then came the paragraph that made tears spring to Marcus's eyes. Sarah wrote, "She is a woman of deep thoughts but few words, and she carries a profound stillness about her. But sometimes, when she is at her work and a church bell rings in the distance, a strange, sad smile will touch her lips. I asked her of it once, and she simply said that a bell's song is a powerful thing, but there is no music more beautiful than the sound a bell makes when it sings its last song." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. He had found her. The legend and the reality, the myth and the woman, had finally met in this quiet, dusty library. Clara had made it. She had not flown on the wings of spirits. She had walked on her own 2 feet, her path cleared by her own brilliant, courageous mind. She had lived. She had been free. She had learned to write her own name. The quiet, profound discovery felt more miraculous than any supernatural flight. He had found the truth, but in finding it, he did not feel the urge to dismantle the legend. He understood now, as Elias had understood, that both stories were true, and both were necessary. A montage of images flickered through the historian's mind. a legacy unfolding across time. He saw the faded ink on the Quaker woman's letter, a testament to a life lived in quiet freedom. He saw the free township near the ruins of Oakhaven, where generations of children who had never known a master's whip played under the Georgia sun, their games underscored by the faint ancestral memory of a bell's 13th toll. And finally, he saw an image of Clara herself, not as a young woman running through the dark, but as an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, sitting by a window in a small but clean room in a northern city. She is sewing, her hands still deft and sure. A church bell rings outside, and she pauses, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. She is free. The story concluded itself in his mind, a final reflection on the dual nature of her incredible act. There was the real story, a testament to the genius and bravery of a single woman who had refused to be a victim, who had studied her prison and dismantled it with its own tools. It was a story of intellect, patience, and breathtaking courage. And then there was the legend, a story of supernatural deliverance that had become a symbol of hope for an entire community. It was a story that inspired them to endure, to resist in small ways, and to believe in the possibility of the impossible. Marcus realized then that the legend was not a distortion of the truth. It was the most important part of Clara's plan. She had not just freed her own body. She had uncaged the spirit of her people. She gave them a story that could never be chained, a hero who could never be caught. The 13th toll of the Oakhaven bell was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was an echo that continued to resonate through the generations, a timeless reminder that even in the deepest, most oppressive silence, one person, with enough courage and a well-placed kerchief, can create a sound loud enough to bring down walls.